So here we are. We're going to start the Sustainability Commission meeting. Since we don't have any leadership here and we don't have enough people to achieve quorum, we won't be able to make any motions or decisions today, but we're still going to carry on with our agenda as planned, barring those things that require a decision. So let's get started with opening. We'll skip the reviewing and approving of agenda. We'll skip the April meeting minutes and move on to public comment. It looks like we have two folks here to give public comment. So
if there's any members of the public, so please raise your hands and we'll let you in to provide public comments. If you want.
Okay. Hi there, Steve. You are unmuted.
Thanks. I'm Steve Bade. I live in Friendly. Thanks for your service, everybody. I am really interested and excited about your committee to investigate perhaps a trade-in for gas-powered leaf blowers or some way to change the conversation around gas-powered yard utilities and tools. So thanks for taking that on. I was not able to come to the last meeting, but imagine I'm there in spirit and I'll be watching what you do and trying to contribute. I'll share that I volunteer at the Toolbox Project, the tool lending library. We hope to serve everyone in the community. And I can't speak for the Toolbox Project yet, but I can imagine that the Toolbox Project would like to get involved somehow in incentivizing swapping gas-powered tools for electric-powered tools, or maybe even rakes, because we have a bunch of rakes. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Let's move on to the other Steve, Steve Morgan. Hi, Steve. I believe you are muted from your end. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, Steve Morgan didn't raise his hand, so
So any other public comment? Commissioners would like to respond.
Thanks for attending virtually and for your interest, and we appreciate it.
We also talked previously about, taking this kind of time to see if there's any comments on, on comments that we received online.
Sure. And so there were two of those that have arrived in the last week or so. And so I'm going to let you talk about the gardening bush issue. And then I'll address the second one that came in today from I think David Van Hay.
Yeah, so one came in from a woman named Jamie. She lives in an apartment complex and she had tried various attempts to grow food at her apartment complex and had been kind of shut down in various ways. And so she emailed the Sustainability Commission asking if we were aware of funding, research, and other, programs in the city that could help her garden. And so I replied. I actually managed the community gardens program for the city. So I am used to responding to inquiries like that. And so I shared about the City of Eugene Community Garden Program. I also shared that there's different funding opportunities through the Neighborhood Matching Grant, as well as through the Green Fund that the Sustainability Commission has, that she could potentially apply for, though she would need approval from her property owner. And then if she was interested in getting more research, she should, reach out to OSU Extension and stuff. So I think that comment has been sort of replied to.
Thank you.
And then for the one that came in today from David Van Hagen. And I think staff is happy to respond in any way the commission sees fit. But I think at this point, because we are still basically operating under an election measure, there are probably limits to what type of conversation we can have. This might be something that the commission wants to revisit in the future when this is no longer an issue and have that conversation. And that's something we can continue to discuss forward. But if I simply, politely responded and said, thank you for your inquiry. Because we're under an election measure, we are subject to Oregon election law. There's probably not a lot we can discuss right now. Would the commission be fine with that? Karen?
Karen,
And that makes a lot of sense, and I appreciate you being the gatekeeper on things like that, and, we did discuss this as a commission. Right, previous to the.
Yeah, I mean, I believe they came and presented to the commission a couple of years ago.
Right.
Yes,
Okay,
yeah, I thought relating to a study that they had commissioned a few years ago, is my understanding.
Yeah.
2 or 3 years ago, yeah.
thank you. That was fascinating.
Yeah, I'd certainly support that notion of just replying at this point in time with, potential measure currently.
Yes. Thank you for reaching out. because of-
Depending on what happens in the night circuit and all of that stuff, but
Got it.
that would be appropriate, not at this time.
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts or feedback on that? No.
Limited consensus support,
Right.
all commissioners present, but no action.
any other public comment? Yep. Or response? Okay, let's move on to council communications and updates.
And so there's actually a budget committee meeting tonight. So Councilor Semple is actually at that tonight. So and there's been a lot of focus. So I guess one of the council updates is there's actually been quite a lot of focus and attention on the budget of late. The budget committee is actually meeting tonight. Talk about that. So that's where Councilor Semple is. Climate is actually a topic, and Matt Rodriguez is actually talking about climate in terms of one of the one of the strategic community priorities, and talking about where that is in the budget. Opportunities, so kind of where funding has come from historically for funding this program and funding climate work, as well as kind of what that's going to look like moving forward in terms of moving to the biennium budget, and what that's going to look like as part of kind of the discussion of how we're going to continue to fund some of this work within the program. So that's kind of a focus of tonight's, or part of tonight's budget meeting, talking about the budget moving forward. A few other things that have come up from council that might be worth reporting. So the health overlay zone was something that came up last month as part of the PDD work plan discussions, and kind of staff I know are back thinking about how sort of that topic plays into their work plan, and thinking about how to address chronic pollution issues across the community. Obviously, there was a work session on fossil fuel response about a week ago. I'm sitting in this very seat for. There was a motion from Councilor Zelenka on the heels of that to try to further scope out that issue, and something that's going to be due in the fall. So that's something where it's finally been brought in front of council again, and there's going to be a little bit of movement to try and figure out some of the gaps and some of the information that's part of that topic, and figure out how that as a mechanism could possibly be something that the city could further pursue, and try to figure out where the policy opportunities are for that. And then
Just a quick thought on that one, you were involved in the work group that looked at that was just as I was coming on board. And if that moves forward to work session, could we make a request of staff that the previous commission action come back to us? Because the commission did some work before several of us, who were in the room now were in the room. So I think it might behoove us to look at prior recommendations around risk bonds that the commission had made on the past.
so I'm aware of one that has happened. You can correct the record.
Right, a recommendation, but I'm just suggesting it might behoove us to have the intention of putting it on a future agenda to look at that recommendation,
Okay, I mean,
because a number of us weren't even on the commission.
Sure, I mean, that seems like something that would be a good topic to possibly bring back for the retreat in the fall to discuss as, a topic of potential interest for the commission to consider in the fall.
Yeah, something like that would be good.
Got it. And then yesterday, and during the election, the 5-year Parks and Levy bond was passed. So that's a good thing. I think, very happy that has happened as well. And then just quickly on council is actually not going to be in session from May 24th to the middle of June, so there's not a lot really on the calendar between now and then. Moving forward, I think one thing probably worth noting, somewhat related to the topic we were just talking about, on June 20th, there's actually gonna be a hearing on hazardous substance users fees under the Right to Know program. And so they, every year they bring the new fee structure back to council on how that fees, how those fees are established and how companies who are subject to those requirements have to pay those fees. And so that's going to be a hearing on June 20th for that. We're ready to talk about the 2 letters that we received. I think that covers both council updates and some of the big things from staff. I thought we were mentioning right now.
I just had one question. Councilor Semple had indicated there would be some discussion, maybe meeting with council about raising more money for homeless and sustainability issues again. I mean, there had been a long time ago, there had been a council work session about that and kind of gone away. Is that happening, or did I misunderstand and that's just part of this budget discussion?
I believe that's part of the unhoused and climate are 2 of the critical issues that are being discussed as part of the current budget discussion.
I can add just a little bit more information. So the city council is interested in having a revenue committee do some work on trying to find some additional permanent funding sources for a few of their priorities. Climate is one, unhoused is one. So that revenue committee hasn't been approved yet. We're currently working on the scope to bring back to city council so that they've got some idea on like the charge of the statement, how far they're going to go, the time frame. But the idea would be to have them begin work over the summer.
Okay, great, thanks, because
Yep.
the commission did provide a list of maybe 10 possibilities that we had considered. Some of them we ruled out, like a fee on a flight from Eugene, a $5 per flight and things like that, which would raise quite a bit of money actually, but so they were more carbon related ways for revenue. So I just wanted to maybe make sure we got that back to that committee again, just for their consideration, since we had put some work into that. So see how that goes.
Were those separate recommendations from the commission, or were those things that ended up in the cap? I know the issue you just raised was one of the community recommendations.
Separate thing.
The letter?
For it, because we've been pushing, we were basically saying, we can't have and realize our goals if we don't put some money into it. Here we got all these goals, we're saying we're gonna do all these things and there's no funding. At least we had 2 now, but it was a situation we were happy with, so we a number of opportunities. So there's still, at least a few of them might still be relevant.
The other question I had, and I brought it up last time with Councilor Semple about the idea of a commission representative in that revenue group. If in fact sustainability is a priority, might we have a seat at the table? And she said she would attempt to discuss it with the mayor. So, for whatever record we're keeping of our informal meeting tonight, we had asked about that.
You asked about that last meeting too, I think.
Yeah.
So. Sounds
I
like.
think that's something Council Semple would have to probably address.
Right.
But yeah,
You'd have a list we could bring.
Right, we have a list.
If we can find it.
Yeah, I was just concerned it slipped by us and we couldn't have a chance to.
No, that's still coming. So you can provide, Counselor Semple the additional information for when that conversation happens, to continue to advocate for your needs, or at least put that bug in her ear for sure. Who will be on the committee will be up for discussion in that meeting as well, right? So they don't know how many counselors will be on it, how many will be appointed. That's all part of what we're trying to bring back in the agenda item summary for them to review.
Okay, should we move on to the presentation?
the commissioner still interested in hearing about. So. Okay. You're gonna get us going. Okay, so I was going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the most recent greenhouse gas inventory for the community that was finished last December and covers calendar year 2021. And so there have been some interest expressed about having somebody talk a little bit about this most recent inventory. And so I guess just to start, for those who are maybe new to greenhouse gas inventories or not as familiar with that, basically I've always seen it as kind of a climate change balance sheet, just a way to try and measure progress against climate goals, climate actions, things that a city is trying to pursue. And really just to provide some of that data to try and measure that progress or accomplishments towards some of those goals. So I thought to start out, I would start with sort of three kind of main greenhouse gas emission related numbers tied to some of the work that's been done under some of the greenhouse gas inventory work to date. So the top number that you're seeing in green is basically tied to the climate recovery ordinance, and it's basically all the fossil fuel use that is being done within Eugene. And again, for the community greenhouse gas emission profile, what that includes is basically everything within the urban growth boundary. So it's not just city property, it includes UGB. And so there's some county property, there's things that are kind of immersed within kind of that patchwork of ownership that exists within the community. But that's basically the boundary, the scope of where these emissions are coming from. So that's really, it's in BTU, and basically it's focusing on fossil fuels for that. The second figure that you see are basically sector-based emissions. Those are local emissions. That's from things like energy use for homes, businesses, industrial activity, vehicle fuels, waste from going to the landfill, and then refrigerants, things that are basically fugitive emissions from things like refrigerants in air conditioning units and cars, things like that. And then the last number are basically the consumption-based emissions, and that's basically everything that is imported into Eugene through consumption. So it's emissions associated with the production of imported goods, laptops, clothing, shoes, services, other things that are basically produced or manufactured elsewhere, but are imported into Eugene for use and consumption by Eugene residents. I thought it might be helpful to have a few maybe terms of art explained for some things. So metric ton, which you'll see in a number of places in some of these charts moving forward. It's basically how scientists measure CO2 emissions. So we're talking about 2,204 pounds. There in smaller numbers, you might talk about in kilograms or grams, but for this, it's metric tons. What I've heard as a sort of a descriptor is that it's often described as a cube that's 27 feet by 27 feet by 27 feet. That's a metric ton of carbon. It's like a visualization. I found that sort of helpful to think about what that means in terms of how much space it takes up. A telephone pole is about 27 feet tall, so that's kind of what 27 feet looks like. CO2 equivalent, or CO2e, is basically a way to compare emissions from different types of greenhouse gases. And so it basically uses what we call a global warming potential to basically convert things like nitrous oxide or fluorocarbons, things like HFCs, into carbon equivalents. So you basically have one number that you're reporting. You're not reporting metric tons of different types of greenhouse gases. You just do it in carbon equivalents. And then the greenhouse gas potential is really a measure of how much heat a ton of gas can actually absorb over a given period of time relative to the amount of heat a ton of carbon dioxide can actually do over that same period of time. So it's a way to figure out how much more heat a particular gas can do. So methane is like 25 times more heat. Nitrous oxide is like 350 times more heat. It's just a way to take these different gases and equate them to their equivalents in carbon. And then BTU is just a measure of heat. So it's the idea that it's the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 pound of water. So it's basically a pint of water, 1 degree Fahrenheit. And it's often used for fossil fuels just to measure the heat content of that particular fuel. And as a way to sort of measure some of that information. So I thought it would be useful just to kind of reiterate kind of the climate recovery goals that the Eugene community is actually trying to pursue. The CRO basically identified 4 goals, 2 for the community and 2 for the city, for city operations. I'm going to focus on the community goals right now. And so there's 2 goals. The first is to reduce fossil fuel use by 50% by 2030 compared to 2010 goals. And then the second is kind of the goal that I find somewhat confusing to talk about in some ways, but it's how to basically by 2100, total community greenhouse gas emissions equate to the city's share of a 350 part per million atmospheric CO2 level. And what that means in sort of practical terms, yes, it's a little bit confusing. What that means in practical terms is trying to reduce emissions by about 7.5% every year, starting in 2016 when the CRO was passed. And so really going beyond where we are now in this, in the 2010 goals, but trying to accomplish a 7.5% reduction goal. And what I'm going to talk about kind of moving forward, I'm going to focus more on the 50% short-term goal, looking at the 2030 goals, but a little bit of the greenhouse gas emissions does relate to this longer-term 2100 goal that is part of the CRO. And so in looking at where kind of what progress has been made against that 50% fossil fuel reduction goal, between 2010 and 2021, fossil fuel energy has decreased by about 14%. Over that same period of time, the population of Eugene has actually increased by about 12%. So per capita emissions have actually reduced by about 24%. So there has been some progress, but there's a lot more work to do. And obviously to try and meet the 50% goal by 2030, we need another 36% reduction in fossil fuel use to try and reach some of that goal. Now, kind of going beyond just fossil fuel use and talking about all other types of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's adding in non-fossil energy used for electricity generation, things like waste, things like refrigerants. This is really, focusing on those types of emissions. So again, that total was 952 metric tons of CO2 equivalent back in 2021. This is basically just a breakdown of where those emissions are coming from amongst kind of the big buckets that are part of the climate action plan. Overall, sector-based emissions have decreased about 10% since 2010. This was really due primarily to emissions from buildings, both residential and commercial industrial buildings. If you look at some of the other areas, waste emissions, so it's like landfill solid waste and emissions from wastewater, those total about 78,000 metric tons. That's decreased by about 6 or 7% since 2010, even with population growth. So that's actually a pretty interesting thing that it's trending in that direction. Fugitive emissions, so that's the refrigerants, which is also 8% of the footprints. That was about 75,000 metric tons. If you look at what that emission was in 2021, that's actually increased by a little over 22%. Of note about that is we don't actually really know what that number is. So that number is basically estimated from state level data and then assigned to the Eugene population. So it's sort of extrapolated, but it is a data gap. In our emissions inventory, we don't have really good data. It's a challenge to actually get good data on fugitive emissions. So you sort of extrapolate from purchasing of refrigerant and other sort of invoices and things like that, but it's not a very reliable number right now in terms of what we think that impact is going to be. And then obviously transportation is still the largest source of sector-based emissions. They did drop, transportation emissions dropped by about 7% between 2010 and 2021. With increased population, there has been a drop, not a big drop, but there actually was a drop, which was a little bit surprising to actually see some of that. There's a much bigger drop in 2020, obviously, because a lot of people weren't going anywhere, they weren't driving. That has rebounded slightly in 2021, but relative to 2010, it was about a 7% drop for those emissions.
Can I ask just a quick question?
Sure.
Because it went so fast. When you were talking about the landfill waste and the wastewater, you said it increased?
Decreased
It decreased.
by about 6% from 2010.
Okay, sorry. I thought you said it increased by 78,000 metric tons, but you said decreased.
No, the number of the metric 78,000 was the actual amount
Oh,
of
okay.
carbon emissions from that segment.
Oh, right, got it.
And
And then,
relative to 2010, it decreased by about 6%.
okay, that's what I was looking at the graph and I'm like, did he just say it? Sorry.
So it's 8% of the burden.
Yes.
That of that 952,000 metric tons, it's about 78,000 metric tons.
Got
That's its
it.
share of that number.
Thank you. Sorry.
And then relative to its change over the last 11 years, it's decreased by about 6%. Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions on the current?
You're covering a lot really fast.
Sorry, I'll slow down.
Okay.
So this basically just takes that pie chart and tries to basically look at the trend over time. As you can see, the trend going back to 2010 has been relatively flat. There are a little bit of changes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but 2012, 2015 had slight dips. That's largely due to those being warmer winters. But if you look at the difference between 2010 and 2021, again, emissions have decreased by about 10% over that period of time, around there. One of the things that was interesting in looking at this was digging a little bit into the data that is between 2019 and 2021, specifically for greenhouse gas emissions from commercial and industrial buildings specifically, was that they were actually down 24% from 2010 and around 17% from 2019. Because that was a pretty pronounced drop, we kind of wanted to look into why that was. And it looks like there are 3 reasons why that is. The first is really due to the weather. And consistently over time, you can see that when it's warmer, you have fewer heating days. You need less energy to heat spaces for 5 or 6 months during the winter. And so that's one, and you see that in residential as well. And so in 2012 and 2015, you see a similar trend, where it's a warmer year, you don't use as much energy, you don't use as much fossil fuel to heat homes. And so emissions have dropped in those years. So that was one of the reasons for 2021. The second reason we think was COVID related, but we're not really sure. We don't have great data to really get into the granular information on how much of that was COVID related, but it seems like you have restaurants, you have commercial entities, you have office spaces where people are working and they're changing their behaviors. People aren't in those office spaces. Restaurants are maybe going to carry out only just to try and stay open, but they're not necessarily having people in those restaurants for a short period of time during COVID. So that was there, but we don't have great data to understand how much of it, but we do think that there was likely a COVID impact there. And then the third reason, which was actually a pretty significant impact, was there were actually 2 industrial facilities that closed in 2020. And those 2 in combination actually combined to add up to almost 24,000 metric tons.
To what kind of facility?
2 industrial facilities, 2 basically wood products companies that were operating in town. And they both shut down in 2020. And so between 2019 and 2021, that contributed to almost a 24,000 metric ton decrease in emissions for commercial and industrial buildings over time. And so if you look at kind of that line, and the difference between 2019 and 2021, just for the commercial industrial sector, that number was about 53,000 metric tons. And so those 2 industrial facilities accounted for over 45% of that drop, which was sort of interesting to kind of see that as making a really big impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And this was just a little bit of a breakout, more of kind of that commercial and industrial sector.
This? Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry.
So this was just a breakout of the commercial industrial sectors. And this was interesting to me only because you can kind of see what sort of sector types are more pronounced in the emissions that they have, as well as see what sort of activities within a sector are really driving a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And again, sort of not surprisingly, space heating. Oregon is a winter peaking climate. And so a lot of energy is used for space heating in a lot of different areas that actually provide the energy to heat some of those spaces. And so the other one was obviously in food service, actually cooking, and the need to have energy for fueling cooking was another big driver. But it was just interesting to kind of see this breakdown. Some of the ones that were sort of popping were sort of interesting to me. I wasn't expecting them, and others that were bigger, I wasn't expecting either. But it's sort of interesting to see the different types of sectors and what sectors seem to be driving greenhouse gas emissions within the commercial sector in particular. And then not that surprisingly, wood products really dominates kind of that in the industrial side of things in terms of where emissions are coming. Before I move on, are there any questions on this line?
Sure. What about the airport? Because that's expanding, and so it
It
seems
is.
like you're gonna get a lot more flights.
It's outside the UGB. That is not,
Oh,
yeah, so they do look at emissions and they work with good company on that, but that is not included in our inventory just because it's not. Part of the emission. Yeah. And I will get to that in the next slide, actually. So this is on that third big number, which was the consumption-based emissions. And so that again is basically consumption of goods and services, cars, food, fuels, appliances, clothing, things like that. And a way to try and take into account kind of the upstream emissions associated with that, with that consumption. So again, the total in 2021 was about 1.5 million metric tons. And so this would actually be considered emissions above the sector-based emissions that I just talked about. So if you wanted to think about emissions in mass for the Eugene community, you add 1.5 million to the 956,000. So about 2.5 million metric tons is an approximation, an estimate of kind of the total greenhouse gas emission burden for Eugene if you include imported emissions. I think important to note for here is kind of similar to refrigerants. These are kind of assumption based, and so they're based on sort of generalized data. So again, it's extrapolating based on Eugene's, population, and kind of data that exists out there from things like the Oregon, wrote this down. The Oregon consumption-based inventory, and then extrapolating that for the population of Eugene.
That was actually related to my question, or is my question. How in the world do you collect that kind of?
Yeah, I know it's.
information, And how do you know, and how would we know if they're using a formula based on population, how would we ever know if we did something here to decrease ours disproportional?
It's hard to track. You actually were reading my mind, because that was one of the things I was just going to mention, is that one of the reasons that we do this is that it's a big number and we want to have a sense of what it is. But what we're finding is as we try to compare this from year to year, it's really hard to compare 2019 or 2017 to 2021, because some of those data, some of those assumptions change, some of the methodologies change. And it's hard to sort of compare because you're comparing sort of apples and oranges, just because some of the underlying data and assumptions that feed into that have changed over time. But this is just a way to kind of get a sense of, there are all these other emissions really tied to consumption. That's the other reason, is that, we drive this by consuming the things that we do, by the things that we buy. There are opportunities to actually affect change there by changing consumption patterns, maybe rethinking diets, thinking about avoiding waste, or buying stuff that's more durable, or reusing items, so that there are opportunities to keep something, have a laptop and take care of it so it lasts longer, you have to buy a new one. But there are limitations in the impact, and there are difficulties in measuring some of those things without really investing a lot of money in trying to sort of find what data might exist. There are probably ways to do it, but I don't think it'd be an easy process nor an inexpensive process to actually do it there. So this was just a way to kind of get a snapshot of where that is, but understanding that it's going to be hard to track progress over time. And the airport's the same way. The airport does buy fuel. There's ways to sort of track what fuel they use, what is used to power like helicopter rides or things that occur kind of within the Eugene area versus, flying to Salt Lake City or something else, which are, emission burdens that kind of go elsewhere. What this number actually does is it takes kind of an average emission profile per household and just multiplies it by the number of households in Eugene. And so again, it's just an approximation of trying to get some sense of what it is. But I think back in 2019, this number was estimated at like 2.1 million metric tons. And they used basically the same, they, good company, used the same methodology, but some of the numbers had changed. And so it actually dropped for reasons that weren't totally clear there. So it's hard to compare, but we wanted to kind of have it out there just to say that there are all these other emissions that are driven by consumption that occurs within the Eugene community, and at least try to put some type of numeric value with that for people to track. But yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's something that we've talked about a little bit, like, would there be a way to actually try and measure this? And we haven't located a good one yet.
Especially if we made some effort in a particular piece to say, let's see if we can get people to waste less food, or let's see if we can get people to do blah, 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 put some effort into it. It'd be nice to have some way of measuring.
I think the food waste is one that could be tracked, because I think you could track that through like emissions from the landfill. If you have less organics at the landfill, you should be getting less emissions out of the landfill. And so you can actually track that. But like the upstream impact of, making fertilizer to grow crops, or, water for, energy through water to feed, livestock, that becomes harder. Tracking sort of that impact becomes a little bit more challenging. So I think for some of these, it might be slightly easier, and others it's a lot more difficult to track some of the upstream impacts.
The other one that comes to mind for me with, the conversation earlier, when Art was talking about some of the revenue things like a transportation fee on air travel that originates here. It gives you some sense of comparative impacts if there were some, required carbon offsets. As a notion, you could get some comparative sense of what their impact might be, or come up with at least a valuation for comparative offsets. I mean, I have grandchildren in London and South Africa. I fly and I buy offsets, to feel a little less guilty. It's like I've heard of compared to indulgences previously sold by the Catholic Church, but I know that, there's a question. But it does have some impact, and they are potential revenue sources if they were implemented as required fees for the use of a material because of its carbon impact. Just a notion that's percolating for me, following up on the earlier conversation.
Well, I think those are all things that, I mean, it ties back to the fossil fuel response conversation as well, and discussing,
Right.
part of that whole mechanism, particularly on the trust fund side of things, is about fees on carbon or fuels or something like that.
Right, because the city is buying offsets because it's not achieving its goals right now.
Yeah.
What if those offsets were, paid by users, even as a different way of looking at it? Yeah, air travel is a big chunk right there, isn't it?
That was interesting though, because meat is actually bigger.
Yeah,
than
meat's
air
big too.
travel, So it's a bigger.
So we get to fly if we're vegan.
If you're vegan, you get to fly.
There's your offset.
No meat for 3 weeks.
But you know what's interesting? It's interesting with the,
Yes.
the air travel thing is that when you buy a ticket, they should offer carbon offsets and they don't.
Some airlines
Some
are
airlines
like
do.
to.
United does, I think, yes,
I've never seen that when I purchased a ticket and I fly.
and rental cars do that now too.
Huh.
And I buy my own locally from a local fund that goes to Mackenzie River Trail. And so, yeah.
So, so this is done every 2 years.
Every 2 years, right now, yes.
And what happens with the information?
I mean, a lot of it, so for the community information, I think part of the challenge that we have is one, trying to see if things that are being done in terms of things that the city can control within the CAP, Transportation Service Plan, Vision Eugene System Plan. Are we seeing kind of the results of a lot of the work and engineering and infrastructure development that's happening in terms of actual emission reduction? Impact within there. It's a little hard to tease out because this is aggregated at such a big level to do that. But I think, the thinking about kind of where some of the policy priorities might be, thinking about some of that. I think in terms of, and I was going to talk about this next if the commission was interested in this, but I think where there's, for the city, more sort of direct value is we also do an emissions inventory for the city operations. And that's a way to really think about where to maybe think about where to do investment or other ways to do target opportunities. I know right now facilities management is doing a big study of all the city owned buildings to try and figure out what the energy efficiency opportunities might be. And this sort of thing helps inform that, to think about kind of what's happening. And it's a way to sort of track progress. One of the things that I wanted to show was, recently, Fleets has made a decision to go to renewable diesel and using R99 in all of our diesel vehicles. And that has had a measurable impact on the city's greenhouse gas emission report. You can actually see when it was implemented and the fact that it was implemented, and it made, a significant, discernible impact on the city's emissions profile. So at this aggregation level, it's harder, but, one of the things that I looked at was there was a third, going back to this chart, is when you looked at the decrease, I wanted to kind of see if there were other industrial facilities that had either gone out of business or had really big changes in their emissions profile. And there were a couple of facilities in town that have had significant reductions. They haven't gone out of business, they're still operating, but they had significant reductions of 1,500, 2,500 metric tons from year to year. And I'm curious in reaching out to them and seeing if there's something that's driving that. Is it a process change? Have they made an energy switch? Is it market driven? They just didn't have as much demand, so they're not operating as much. To try and understand what that is, because I think that helps inform some of our thinking and conversation as we try to, talk about decarbonization. Are there things that are being done? So there, when you can dig into the data a little bit, I do think there are opportunities to think about how to tailor and refine and target some of the outreach and some of the programs that might be stood up.
It'd be interesting to know. Industrial, is that how many jobs lost as well?
Yes,
And what, what the other impacts? of
yes,
that?
no, because that is the social equity part of this, yeah.
I guess I was partly wondering, is there any kind of it sounds like there is an internal effort within the city to address the goals for the city organization.
There is, I mean, there always is,
Yeah.
and it's, prioritization and available budgets and, what can be done first and what's gonna kind of have the biggest bang for the buck.
In terms of policy recommendations regarding this, then is that up to us? Should we be saying, okay, what do we think we should be focusing on? Should we get to the council? You know, other
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a great answer for that right now. I think you can look at this chart, and obviously, like, transportation dominates things and it's gonna for the foreseeable future. And like where the policy interventions are there is a little bit of a question, right? They're one, because you do things like the transportation systems plan, and it's not something like you have a plan, you have a whole lot of money and you implement it. It's something you're implementing over years, if not decades. And each little piece hopefully contributes to building up that infrastructure and developing bike paths or pedestrian friendly, but you also have to do that in partnership with LTD. And we can't really control what LTD is doing. And so, where they choose to do bus routes, and does that serve the community in a way that helps people make transportation decisions that maybe can help that number as well. Some of those are things that aren't necessarily policy decisions that council has any control over. So trying to figure out where those intervention points are, and then where kind of you can push. Is there funding for it? Is it part of somebody's work plan? So I think that's a good question. I don't have a good answer for right now, but I think that's definitely, it helps identify this is continuing to be an area of focus. And maybe continuing to identify that this is a big area that has some additional need for attention or impact, or thinking about ways in which you can actually intervene and make a difference there.
Let's take one more question and then, what percent of decrease did the city see from R99 use?
I don't know if I have a percent from the city's own operations. I mean, diesel went basically to zero in terms of emissions, but that I don't have a number. It was about 900 metric tons. So can you divided by 6,000? So whatever that number is. So 900 divided by 6,000, which I can't do in my head right now. So about 18%.
So R99 is the renewable.
He's gonna have a graphic on that
Oh, okay.
too, that'll show how it's over time.
So any other questions on the community base at this point? I do have a couple slides on the city's inventory if people would want to go through that.
Yeah.
Questions about it.
So similar to go to this one. So similar to the community, there are two climate recovery ordinance goals for the city operations as well. One is the same goal, which is a 50% reduction by 2030 from 2010 emissions or fossil fuel use. And then the second one is for the city to be carbon neutral, and Dennis has kind of really referenced kind of what we're doing to accomplish that goal. So this is again just focusing again on fossil fuel use from the city. The city, in addition to the 50% by 2010 goal, had an interim goal of 25% by 2020. And based on the data that we have in-house, we did accomplish that goal. We're a little bit over that. It actually looks like we've actually reduced emissions by a little over 26% between 2010 and 2021. Much of that was driven by two things. One was getting off the steam plants back in 2013, and that accomplished about 1,100 metric tons in reduction. And then the second one was the kind of the permanent replacement of going to renewable diesel. And there's a little bit of bumpiness there over some years because it was hard to source for a while, but I think the fleet department has really figured that out and figured out how to source that. We have a consistent supply. And I think that's going to be kind of a permanent sort of reduction that's going to be part of city operations for that. And then obviously the second goal, which is carbon neutrality, the city is currently purchasing offsets from a forestry conservation project that's based up in Washington. But I know this commission has looked at this in the past. It's a little bit of a fuzzy situation in terms of we would love, I think, to find an opportunity to invest in something locally, but I think there are probably some budget limitations for that. And the lack of, really viable projects that exist to actually invest in this community. But I hope that we can continue to find ways to do that, whether it's through fee structure, whether it's something else, because I think that's a good way to try and, build capacity and build offset, infrastructure within the local community. I think that'd be a good thing on a number of different levels for the city to try and figure out a way to do that.
So when I'm looking at this, what I see is between 2010 and 2021 that we eliminated natural gas use in the city. How about that?
It's diesel.
Oh, the diesel. Okay, because it's,
Yeah, so
The dark.
the dark blue at the bottom is diesel.
but the natural gas use actually increased.
That was in part due to basically getting off of the steam plant, and that was basically replaced by natural gas. But the carbon intensity of that versus burning the wood chips and the other stuff that they were doing in the steam plants reduced emissions significantly. And so this is again going beyond just fossil fuel use, to looking at all greenhouse gas emissions. So it's adding waste, it's adding refrigerants, non-fossil electricity from UWEB. And so there's a lot going on here, but I think so just some quick numbers. So in 2021, and for the city, so the community does its inventory on the calendar year, the city does it on the fiscal year. So in fiscal 21, greenhouse gas emissions from city operations was 5,238 metric tons. So it's not a big number, but that was the number that it was. That was down from 6,126 in 2019 and down from 7,270 back in 2010. So from 2010 to 2021, it was about a 28% reduction overall. The city did have a goal to try and reduce it by 60% by 2020 that we have not met. We're about halfway there with that goal. Again, it was about 2,000 metric tons in reduction between 2010 and 2021. That was again, as Mitra had asked, driven by two things primarily, and that was basically getting off the steam plants and then basically getting rid of diesel and using renewable diesel as part of that. And so the last one, so put your risen my mind, because I think this is a
Just a moment, I think we do want to, emphasize that the even when the target was established, it expected verified carbon offsets as a mean to achieve that neutral goal.
yes. Yeah. And so that becomes the other challenge is to have, to make sure that they can go through that process as well. And that had certainly when offsets were first being explored and when the city was looking at what the options would be, kind of finding affordable, verifiable, kind of, local, somewhat local. So not necessarily offsets in Vermont, but if we could find something in the Pacific Northwest was a challenge that I think staff were trying to wrestle with for a while. And I know people on this commission were looking at this as well.
Yeah, when the committee talked about that, and part of the thing is the ordinance says that they shall be verified carbon. And there are a limited number of those that are certified, verifiable. So we either have to change the ordinance or change that, and that gets tricky to figure out. And some of the local ones, as you say, are more expensive.
Yeah, and I think if it was verified local and there's a compelling case to be made about here are the other benefits that are accruing to the local economy, to the local community through that, I think there's an argument to be made for that. But I don't know that, the city's paying $8.50 right now. I don't know that if it was a $50 per credit project, that's something that we would be able to defend a budget for that. But I think there might be an ability to have that conversation at a number. Maybe there's something with, destruction of HFCs that can become, I know Louisa, she's not here, but that's something that she's talked about a little bit. And if there might be a project there, and it really kind of depends on the price point where that is. But again, that would be something that could have multiplying benefits. It could have a benefit from a greenhouse gas perspective. There is revenue streams to local businesses by doing this, and it's an ability for the city to possibly purchase those offsets as well, if they generate locally. So things like that, I think, are projects that we want to continue to try and look at and think about whether it's something that could actually be stood up and developed in the Eugene community.
Try to meet the goals.
Well, I think it's in both directions, right? I think we're definitely trying to, reduce emissions, but we can't take one swing and get rid of all of them at once. So I think it's again trying to identify what are the biggest payback opportunities, where can we get the most benefit for the buck, learning from things like we've done at Echo Hollow in terms of putting in new systems and how that's worked, and maybe not worked as well as we hoped, and learn from that as a way to think about investments. I think the new city hall is going to offer a lot of opportunities to think about kind of how to do things on the energy efficiency front as well. So yeah, I think all of that kind of plays into this for sure. Yes, it'd be great to get rid of a lot of the use within our operations and not necessarily on offsets. I think in the city there's a strong interest in doing that. And then I think I had Mitra in mind perhaps, but I just found this a really fascinating charts looking at city fleet emissions. over the past 11 years, really focusing on the diesel information. In particular, the gas has gone up, and I think that's just more vehicles and more people within the city. But renewable diesel has made kind of a demonstrable impact on kind of greenhouse gas emissions for the city. And kind of going back to 2017, when the city started looking at this, there were a little bit of supply chain issues, and 2018, 2019 it was hard to source some of this, but they sort of been able to fix that within the city in doing that. And what you can see is between 2019 and 2021, all the greenhouse gas emission reduction attributable to the city, so basically going from 6126 down to 5238, is singularly attributable to actually going to renewable diesel, with almost 900 metric tons that are attributable to actually that thing. And I think that's a really good success story about supply chain issues and innovative technology, and thinking about creative ways to meet sort of a challenge or sort of a goal of the CRO, and having a place where maybe, particularly for medium and heavy duty vehicles, the electric vehicle market isn't quite ready to meet some of the equipment needs that the city has. And so renewable diesel, literally just a drop-in replacement, allows us to continue to progress forward on this and use it really. And I think, we view it as somewhat of how long that bridge is, we don't know, but it's viewed as a bridge until sort of some of these other technology markets are more mature and kind of can serve the duty cycle and the needs that the city needs for that equipment.
I'll take the moment once again to say that renewable diesel is now available for public purchase at Sequential. And it's, it can plug into any diesel vehicle right now, which for not only the city, but other private parties who have to have like tow something or have a big work truck, is a very nice option. So I just want to set again at this pinnacle moment that you've said again before. Thank you.
So one thing I noticed here is that as we slowed down the diesel use and then completely replaced it, the amount of gasoline blends, which R99 is a gasoline blend, right? Do you consider it a gasoline?
Diesel.
Nice diesel.
Well, then how is it reflected on there? Am I missing something?
It's gone because
It's the hatch mark. So that's represented by here. So that's basically avoided emissions.
Oh, okay,
What that
so
represents.
R99 has
So the
zero
diesel
emissions.
emissions for 2021 is just little. It's like 0.2%.
Oh, okay, I understand. Thanks for clarifying.
To explain I always love that, explain the logic of why those emissions are gone. You're still burning the diesel.
So it's
and the
based on a
carbon
life
going
cycle
into-
basis because of the feedstock used to actually produce it is basically biological feedstock. And so it's counted as part of a life cycle carbon contents. And so it's basically, instead of pumping hydrocarbons and processing them and refining them and igniting them, it's basically done off of, and you might know more of this, but I actually do, but it's basically using feedstock waste that would otherwise have been burned or disposed of in some other way, or just incinerated for energy, and turning into a fuel stock. And so on a life cycle basis, it becomes a nearly zero carbon emission source.
So that's compost.
It's like an offset. I mean, truly, it's still happening.
Right.
But
So there was this over in the food, and there was also the diesel.
Yes,
And now you just have.
yeah, basically, yeah.
So either the food disappeared. or
I
the
guess, yeah, I guess, yeah.
It's okay,
I guess
but instead of 2x, you have
Yes,
X.
yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's a good way to talk about it. Instead of 2x, it's just X, or instead of 4x, it's 2x, yeah.
But where's that stuff produced? Is it produced in Oregon?
There's actually, I don't know if it's open yet, but there was talk of actually having a refinery that was gonna be up in Portland near the CEI hub.
Oh, because then I would think that there would be a emission reduction from the landfill because of that.
Well, it depends on where. well, no, no,
It's reduction
It's not
from
currently-
here.
Yeah, there's talk when I was talking with Lane County climate people, when that committee was still happening, there was talk of potentially making it from more locally from like remnants from the logging industry. I don't know if that's been happening, but that was like, the cool thing is you can make this from, but it doesn't have to be an oil form like biodiesel, which makes it a lot cleaner burning on an engine, but they can make it from a lot of a variety of like organic materials, waste materials. So it's still, I mean, it's definitely become more prevalent and accessible than it had been even a year ago when I looked into it and researched it. But it's a highly developing like technology and you know, probably, I haven't looked into it recently to see where it's being made or where we're getting it specifically in Eugene from, but.
It's been a couple different places, I think right now, so. I'm misremembering this now, but for a while they were getting it from the Midwest and basically shipping it by train, which was having a little bit of impact in terms of upstream emissions. But there is some discussion, and I thought it was actually up and running, but maybe they're permitting and building it, but they were going to be building a refinery up in the Portland area.
Well, so you weren't here when they had field burning, but they used to field burn and burn all this stuff. I mean, I just thought of it, where's all that ag waste going now? Is it going to the landfill?
A lot of it's landfill, or they can consider it as like a waste to energy project.
Right.
I know they can't put a lot of that into. Those because of the potential. Well, yeah, that's it. I'm not.
So it does seem,
But I also think there's a feedstock challenge, right? There's going to be limits among the feedstock. At some point, you're going to hit that barrier where there's going to be limits, like you're going to find with renewable natural gas as well, where you're not going to have enough feedstock to actually feed that process to meet all the demand.
But if you're not feeding as many cattle.
I think that's why they're looking into all these other possible like
Yeah.
organic waste materials from other industries, which is, you know, really fascinating to think about the potential there.
For Oregon in particular.
Or
Yeah.
something?
Well, no, like the timber industry and like, I mean, I don't know, I haven't even been able to think through it, but I think they said they're working on potentially looking into creating renewable gasoline and propane as well. Just talking to the guys at Sequential, they were saying something about that. And I don't know, I haven't looked into it.
so what is the supply situation? And I mean, what my the comment I was gonna make was that it does seem like a real success story and one that would be great to find ways to promote it, not just to toot the city's horn, although that's not a bad thing, but to promote it as something that other private parties could
It's actually,
pursue if it's available. really.
they've been trying, I mean, there was attempts to promote it when it first came onto the market. I found when I researched it, when we were doing our electric vehicle committee, there was this ad or news article on how they were trying to push it in Bend at the gas stations, and I don't think it ever went over well, and I think they use it in California. I don't know what, I think because it's a temporary bridge kind of concept, I don't think they're pushing it heavily.
But if you
But I don't know, I honestly don't
You
know.
don't have to change your vehicle in order to. use
Yeah,
it.
I mean, I actually
And it
literally,
reduces emissions. Why wouldn't we want to try to get as many people as could be supplied?
for a
use
while,
it?
it was a demand, a supply problem.
Right.
And I think that has just recently changed, so maybe there could be more attempts to do that.
Well, except for the fact that the airlines have embraced this too. So if you got airlines and then city fleets and
Yeah, the
whatever, it's
supply.
like,
Yeah.
There's not enough.
It's gonna be-
yeah.
It's going to be a feedstock.
I just want to do a quick time check. We were supposed to be done with this presentation at 6:30 and at 6:40, but we can no longer do nominations because we don't have quorum, so let's maybe just do a few more minutes to wrap this up, and then we'll move into the education committee, just to keep us on track. But I don't want to keep the conversation. This is great.
Actually, a vote on a nomination.
Yeah, we might have a discussion even if we couldn't take action.
Right.
Well, yeah,
Either way, we need to move up.
let's
we
maybe
need
do a
to
few more minutes just to wrap this up, and then we'll talk about what's possible with nominations.
Fascinating, thank you.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And so I think just to build on what you just said, I think it isn't just the city. This is actually part of a purchasing collaborative that has been done between UM, the city, the county. I think Springfield might be involved in it. I'm not sure if the school districts are, but those are kind of, in terms of big institutional users, like really, obvious LTE are really obvious places to do this. And they've created a mechanism by which other institutions, other organizations in Plain County can actually be part of this and actually, a lot of the work has been done, so they can actually participate in this and kind of, if they wanted to use this as part of their process, be part of that.
What's the side conversations?
So it's already bigger than just the city. There's other governmental institutions who have done this, and I think it's really been driven by UN. And I think the other thing, you might have experienced this with your truck. I know that for fleets with biodiesel, that created a lot of problems. It created a lot of problems with like algae in tanks.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, there was just a kind of a resistance for people to transition to biodiesel because it kind of gels in cold weather and there's a lot, you know, it can jam up your injectors, like there's, and this, because I did so much research, I purchased a diesel vehicle because I do tow trailer and that was the most sustainable option because I knew R90 was coming. But yeah, sorry, I could talk for a long time about it.
But even city vehicles, I know that like they gunk up the vehicles.
Yeah.
And you just sit there and like just idle because you wanted to burn off that stuff. Otherwise the truck just wouldn't work. Or if you're running a fire truck and you get up a hill somewhere because you got
Yes.
a fire, you can't have that truck back. Because you've got, you know, deposits and stuff going on inside the engine. So yeah, it was sort of, the biodiesel was like, I think well intentioned, but probably not well good in implementation.
Went the way of the like, what is it, the big video disc? It was like. It was there for a little bit and it served a purpose to segue us to the next thing. Yeah. Sorry.
Max. That's really all I have.
Oh, great, very.
That's all.
That was the short version.
Thank you.
So.
And we've got some more detail in the piece you sent us.
Yeah, and the report has a lot more detail, but these were kind of the big take homes, and then trying to dig into some of the things that we saw as trends that were interesting and like, oh, what's kind of driving that? What are the things that are maybe behind that story of why we're seeing drops? It's kind of interesting.
So get the next 50% is gonna be tough.
Yeah.
And that's your
That's
job.
what-
My job. Okay.
You're gonna get that.
I might have to talk about
That next
rates.
25%.
Job. What?
That's what happened.
We got your back. I got your back.
Yeah, well,
The first chunk was easy and then,
Yeah.
yeah, right.
then it
Yeah,
became.
that was only two big chunks, because
Yeah, but I think there's progress, right? And so one of the things within the city, let me pull that up, but I think one of the things that's not showing up in the city profile is kind of what's going to happen with all the work that was done at Echo Hollow. So that was completely redone, new system, heat pumps, a lot of stuff that's there. We're still trying to get it commissioned and having it work as it's designed, but once that's up and running as it should, I think that should make a big difference. It'll be interesting to see what impact that makes on buildings. What was interesting is the community in the city is almost inverse. And so the city has 54% of its emissions burden is transportation. For the city, 55% is buildings. So we're kind of, we have different challenges that we're facing on there. And I know within fleets that there's a big interest, particularly in light duty vehicle, as more options come online, as time of replacement comes up. The city's going to EVs, like that's the direction that we're going. Used to the huge battery of charging stations at the yard, so the city's moving in that direction. And as time of replacement comes up and we have budget to do so, all the light duty vehicle fleets are going to become electric fleets. And that's going to continue. So I think there will be continued progress on the transportation side. I don't think you're going to see as huge of an impact immediately, like we saw with the diesel, like that's almost overnight or within a year, we saw that, and it's going to take longer. I think the buildings is the tougher thing, just because you're gonna have to invest over periods of time and take time to do that over however many, where you have budget to do that under the CIP and other budgetary.
Well, and we might also see an increase actually in the building sector with the move to City Hall, to the new City Hall, because that's a way less efficient building than this building and the library and stuff.
Yeah, so we'll have to see what that impact's going to be. There's going to be an addition by adding the EWA building as the new City Hall, and then this building and the library and some of the other buildings that are going to be vacated. So we'll move that. I think it's probably going to be a net increase, but we don't actually know what that impact's going to be. And then there's work to be done to actually improve the efficiency of that EWA building, City Hall.
you can see that it takes the whole group that's organized, to realize this goal. Then you take the general community at large. We're not organized to reach this goal, we're just individuals doing things, and you can see that there's a big resistance to moving any of those numbers. It is pretty impressive that there's been any decrease at all. Yeah. Because new technologies are coming, people are buying better bulbs, people are buying electric vehicles. It's amazing how many there are in hybrid vehicles. startling, but still, you know, if that's the thing, maybe that's where this commission can somehow, you know, move the public somehow. Well, that's a little bit with our outreach thing. Again, thinking about that as a way to give people, you know, ways to do things or how they can get their some part of their neighborhoods organized to do things.
That's a great segue to our education.
Do we want to go to
So
education or do we
there's
want
the remaining topics, there's nominations, which is it possible for us to have at least a conversation about it? And maybe see
we might ask who's willing.
if there's any interest.
And we can at least have that kind of discussion.
And you were nominated for either chair or vice chair last year, and then you, as I recall, you withdrew. When Louisa said she was. So you're trying to blank that from your memory.
I'm sure it was because I felt too new and not really. I think I'd prefer not to be chair, but I could consider being vice chair if that was.
I think the expectation would be the following year, you might be in the other position, but you could get used to it.
Says the guy that's leaving the board.
Yeah, right.
Irish Landers too.
You're leaving.
Well, you're not.
I have so much on my plate, I'm just gonna implode. I mean, I've thought about it because I'm a 3-year. But I was hoping that GM.
I would be willing to be a vice chair, but not a chair, because again, too much.
You consider.
I
the
think
chair
we
the
all
following year,
are.
then?
Maybe.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah,
suggest
I-
that you two might have a conversation about how a vice chair
Do a
could lighten the chair's load.
I just became the only co-chair of my neighborhood association because no one stepped up to be my co-chair.
Well,
So I'm forcing them to rotate, but that's gonna kill me probably. I can't wait to not do that anymore.
We don't have any other veterans.
I can't get out of that pool May.
But we don't
That's
have
me
any
a
other
day.
veterans.
Who else is here?
Well, there's
Next year.
Chris,
May next.
2024.
Chris and Hannah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know.
and-
I'm done with this May.
You're already done.
You know, part of the issue we've got here is. we don't have-
I have to
One
make the
person,
same kind
let's
of
get one person talking at a time.
Sorry.
So lift your cards up if you want to talk and I'll try
Okay,
to
yeah,
call
right,
again.
we should get all together again. Dennis, you were asked. I think.
Okay, well, yeah, I'd have to figure out some things to step out. Because I'm pretty full right now. I'm, you know, affiliate minister with the local church. I'm a consulting minister in Roseburg and do supply, but you know, some of that's possible. Well, let's talk, maybe 3 of us. Does that do we have to do a public meeting if it's only 3 of us? No, if it's not an informal function, it's just a conversation.
Well,
We can talk.
I can't have a quorum.
Right, but if it's a committee, you can't even have a quorum of a committee, since we're not a committee, it's an informal
I think
conversation.
it's a discussion. Yeah.
would you please again review what the roles are, what the role of the chair is, because Laura went through it last time and said you lead the meeting, basically.
Yeah, so I think a big part of that is to basically help facilitate these meetings. I know that it has changed over the years. Some chairs have been a lot more active than others. But it can, you know, be a part of helping to develop, approving agendas, but helping to develop agendas. You know, the chair and the vice chair every year, the work plan and the annual report are presented to and approved by council. So that's part of the duty, is to be part of that and present that information. It can be, you know, decisions on for standing up, you know, committees, or, you know, Art had sent a letter about possibly submitting a letter on behalf of the commission with regard to some committees to possibly be considered for next month and things. So things like that are decided on by the chair. I think a lot of it is, and then working with staff on, you know, focus areas, trying to bring topics to the commission, thinking through what's you know, the work plan might be, and a lot of the topics that will be discussed next year, and then basically meeting with Mayor, Council Semple to talk through kind of where the commission is, kind of where that's going. I think I know one of the issues that we're gonna need to talk about at some point is the process for getting committees, and that stood up, and part of that's going to be leadership going to meet with the mayor, with Councilor Semple and with staff to kind of go through kind of where that is, what the idea is, how that process is going to unfold. Is that something that's in line with council's priorities and their focuses, you know, how it ties to work plan for staff. And so that, you know, chairs will be part of that process as well.
Yeah, there's a lot involved.
There can be, yeah.
I think that you should be the chair with all that stuff, and I'd be happy to facilitate the meeting.
I don't think I can serve as chair.
So who else is on our committee besides us?
So Chris and Hannah are not here tonight.
Right, and those are the only two who are continuing on.
Yes.
But in this room, it's Chris, Hannah,
Laura is.
us, and no Art.
She's continuing forward. Well, I mean, we have to resolve that because her term is up.
Yeah.
And she's still talking to Counselor Evans about whether he wants to
be reappointed.
She's interested in being reappointed on there.
Oh, Laura, right on.
Laura,
You can't.
But she can't be.
Not for 2 years.
So
I
I'm
think.
kind of piggybacking on Karen, because I want, so in your estimate then, what would be helpful is, well, there's two parts, so like time. So if I think about it as being co-chair of a neighborhood association, I probably spend 20 hours a week on that job.
You have
It's
a job.
insanity. That's crazy. It's way too much. It's way too much. But other than that, and I'm changing that now that I'm the only one in charge, that's gonna change. But so, that being said, like, what is your estimate then of like, say, a chair and a vice chair, like?
I
anything?
I'd be remiss to answer that.
Right,
I don't
it is a
actually-
good question
I don't
for
actually
Laura.
know. It's a good question for Laura and Louisa.
And then the second part of that is it not kind of, I mean, how strict is the chair, vice chair relationship? Like, if someone is like up for running meetings and someone else is not, but they want to do all the other things, or how much flexibility do they have together to decide like what their roles really are?
Based on the bylaws, the chair
Okay.
is kind of the chair.
Okay.
And only when the chair is not there, then the vice chair basically takes their place. But yeah, I think it's basically, and basically on the city's guidelines as well for how boards and commissions are operated, is that the responsibility does lie with the chair. And if
So
the
it
chair
is a
unable
chair
to-
heavy.
Yeah,
role?
with regard to, how the chair plays a role in working.
in terms of the public things.
Because
But
it's
what
different
happens
also,
in terms of discussions and, explorations,
Yeah,
that's
that would be a
negotiable.
question for Laura and Lisa in terms of the conversations that they have between the two of them.
Well, we have a past chair sitting right here in the striped shirt. Art, you were chair. You never were chair. How's it feel?
Try not to.
He's always done a lot of committees and stuff. I mean, so you could do more being on committees and.
That's true.
And speaking of the.
So
That's what he's the
what
way
do
he
you
used
want
to
your
do it.
workload to be?
On committees.
I want Zach back.
But, yeah, right. You know.
So I'm reading the bylaws and it
That is
looks
election
like,
results, the LCC board.
Yeah, yeah.
Really? Oh, that's cool.
it looks like the chair in the bylaws is really in charge of presiding over all meetings
Right.
and sort of overseeing decisions that are made during meetings. But then the chair or chair's designee is the official spokesperson on pretty much all other matters. So to me, that kind of, maybe we would need to check with council support staff to make sure we're understanding that correctly, but to me, that kind of, opens a little bit of a door for the vice chair to take on some more duties.
But it also says, and I'm reading it now, may not be elected for more than 2 consecutive
Oh, we're gonna get Laura back.
successive terms. So if Laura is willing, she could. So we can't talk much more about it.
I'll have to cross that with the
It
city.
does seem like you have a number of people interested.
Guidelines to make sure it's in line with that.
In vice.
Well, I mean, the key part here is that we've been under,
Yes.
like,
true.
how many
There's lots of vice chairs.
two
So
in the last year?
continues.
two.
But
But
I'm
is there
fine
a
if you
way
want
to
to
do
do it.
this so that one person facilitates and then you divide up all those things? So, okay, who can go to the meeting with the mayor this week? Who can go to the city council meeting? Who could like,
Right.
All right.
I don't know, I think that we would, I
We
think
still
we
want to
could
try
do
the
it.
education item.
Yeah, so it sounds like we can't come to
Just organized.
Right.
Then you
any action or a clear sense of moving.
I'm happy to see many people stepping up, because it's interesting, usually everybody does.
None of us stepped up, it was one group of people were all pointing fingers at each other.
I mean,
Yeah, I opened up some.
People are at least willing to think.
Well, this is a group of doers too, I mean,
Oh,
you don't have no in your vocabulary, none of you. I know.
But a related question, I've sent, I think, two, or at least at the very least, one, person who I know is very interested in the commission and their contact information, and I never received anything back from either of you on that, like, I don't know where to give that information or who to share that information with.
So right now, we're collecting that as a,
Okay.
so I should have said I received it. and
Thank
we're
you,
kind of
yeah, it was
sorry
just
that-
sort of like, did it go?
So we're trying to
somewhere?
figure out how to collect those names and present them to
Great.
council members as potential candidates.
We have one too for you, because I know someone who contacted one of the councilors with a vacancy. And I don't think they received any response, so there may be another way to feed that into the process.
Okay,
Yeah.
do you know which counselor?
Yes.
No, you're not saying. All right.
Okay, let's talk education.
okay, so let's move on to the education committee update. Sounded like we wanted to talk about the survey a little bit and talk about what the goals were there.
Yeah, Laura asked me to.
Okay, you're facilitating this part.
Okay. And in our little email conversation, we do have the draft survey question, we can talk about that. I think there was some thinking we should back up and just take a moment and say, what is our goal with this survey anyway? And then help us guide whether we have the right questions or not. What do we do with the information once we have it? How do we collect it? Is it electronic? Is it written? Is it what? And then what do we do with the information? Right? That's my understanding. So if we start with what the goals are, I don't know that we ever super clearly defined our goals, but I think it's really to help capture the feedback from the people that we are meeting with in our first effort to find out how helpful the presentation was, but just in generally, what are they thinking about sustainability issues and what the city is or isn't doing or could or couldn't be doing. And then also, what I'm what that those goals are.
I was gonna further push that to what the goal of that presentation is in the first place. Like, when I brought up the idea of a survey, it was more to check if that presentation, like to be a check of whether our educational presentation was accomplishing its goal.
Right.
So I suggested initially with the intention of checking, like making sure that's working, and I think if my memory serves me correctly, we had some discussions that came from Councilor Simple about like, that was a priority, education and outreach for the council, so we might want to check back in with that. But also, like, part of it was to tell people who we were, which I think should be kind of a small part. And the other part is with the intention of like being the liaison, bringing a collective voice of the public to the city council, and then also communicating back to the public what the council is doing, like this transmitter of information both ways, that's like a neutral party. That was kind of my understanding of our role and the role of the presentation. So checking that, like, so the surveys should be related to checking in on that goal. So that was just my.
Oh, yeah, as I understand what you're saying, there's really kind of two options. One is an evaluation of the presentation's effectiveness. And the other would be to gather specific information that might in fact get shared with council.
Yeah, because part of our role is
We
to
got
bring.
2,000 surveys from these presentations and 999 of them said this.
Yeah.
You are implying you're gonna have almost a standing committee of survey response and understanding those and taking those in and reading them and
That's
putting
true.
them together to create a
That's a
message out
little-
of that. So that's a new thing
That's a little,
that you're taking on as.
Well, could we, just a minute, could we do this in steps? So if, are people in agreement then about what the goals of the presentation is in the survey? So,
Well, I was just putting my.
right, well, that's what I'm saying. So before we jump to, well, what are we gonna do with the information? I would like to try to stick with that part first. That makes
Well, I
sense.
think you have to step back and go, how are we gonna collect the information? I'm having a sticking point on that.
the survey piece.
Well, yeah, because I brought this up in an email, but if you're gonna get these, first of all, if it was me and I was sitting on one of those presentations and I got a thing where I'm supposed to write these big answers, it would not get done. I don't really think so. And if it did get done, as Art brought up, who's gonna go through all those and analyze the data and collate the responses? And that's why I suggested that perhaps we do something that was easy to get at, simple information that we're trying to gather with multiple choice stuff. I'll fill a survey out that I do multiple choice and then I can have a comment.
Right,
And
1
that's
to
something
10 value.
Right, and that's something you can set up as and then that's something you can set up online as like Monkey, whatever it is, or Survey Monkey or something like this, where that collates the data for you as well. This idea of handing out a piece of paper to people and having them sit there and write stuff, or maybe going online, it's just, as we just exhibited, everyone is like over the top, and it doesn't even have to be from overcommitment, it's just modern day society has been worked out. So something like this, I mean, do we want it to be effective? Is it something that we want to create value and we want responses? Then we should make it user friendly, not only for the respondents, but also for the people receiving the information.
There is a vision, Eugene, or something that could, the
Right.
Sustainability Commission put up a survey that would be there for 6 months. As you go to the meetings and you
Engage Eugene website.
engage, Eugene, thank you. So that would be an action person. Anyway,
Yeah,
that's my question.
that's something we've discussed in the past, is using that as something that could be maybe sponsored by the sustainability program on behalf of the commission to collect information on things like that, like your scales or yes, no questions. Was this helpful?
Oh, I was gonna say, I really agree with you there. There's a fine art to surveys and you have to have a system in place to really make any kind of survey worthwhile with how are you gonna use the data and where is it collected and who sees it. And I do think whittling it down to, what is the survey measuring? Like getting 100% clear on that. Keeping it simple, preferably yes, no, or like we're giving them X amount of options and they're selecting one of them. So that, and putting it online where you can have a survey that's written out with a QR code or something that takes them online. And yes, that is an accessibility issue, I understand. But for it to be not putting a huge burden of work on someone to literally go in and translate that into a digital form so it can be collected in a manner. Because if you do an online survey, it can populate in a spreadsheet, which you can immediately turn into a graph, which will just continue to gather that over a certain period of time until it's ended and add to the percentages, and it's very easy to read. So I think if it resulted in a presentation, either for our back-end use of the commission or presentation to the council, that type of survey, which can be read and collected and processed and understood in that manner would be optimal, in my opinion.
I completely agree with Mitra, because I just did a survey, just a neighborhood, we got like 60 people that responded, which I thought was pretty good, actually. And we just did it in a Google form and sent it out in the MailChimp. And we went through as a committee, each question was painstakingly thought out in a committee setting. And to make sure that we were going back to your point, sticking with the goal of the survey. So for example, like if you look at question number 3, what sustainability actions are you taking? Do we really want to know that? Like, what's the goal of that question? Like, what are we gonna do with that information?
Right.
From one person saying, I bathe my dog at home.
You're gonna have a million.
I mean,
answers.
what are you gonna see? Right, I mean, the variation there. If there's something we wanna know, like. I wanna know how many people are composting at their kitchen scraps. You could ask,
Right.
do you compost your kitchen scraps? Yes or no? And then you actually have a data point that might relate to a goal. I'm not saying that's a goal of this survey. I'm just throwing that's the kind of question. You've gotta think about every single question and what information you wanna know.
And you can have a checklist that says what sustainability things. At one time, yeah.
Right, and I had a similar thing with like gas powered leaf blowers. It's like, what's important to you? These things. It isn't, what's important to you?
Yeah.
Right, I mean, because I mean.
There was reference to the Engage Eugene project, which is the city attempting to get, input from citizens. Is there a way to get sustainability related questions as part of that existing process? And then part of this, these presentations would invite people afterwards to go to Engage Eugene and respond to some questions there. I mean, I'm just trying to understand that process.
I mean, that sounds like what you've just described.
Well, I
Me
mean,
too.
Eugene is more of a platform. I mean,
Yes.
it's a website
There
platform.
could be a
and there's-
sustainability question.
So engage, yeah,
Yeah,
engage
it
is
would
a
be its own
platform,
survey.
and then within the platform, there are topics that have surveys or information or opportunities to put it out on a map or move huge in terms of where you want to see.
Right, so that may be an existing format within the city to have the input come in and would be systematically tabulated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be.
27% of the people answered,
Or something specific to
false.
sustainability or a sustainability commission survey hosted by the sustainability program on Engage Eugene.
So it would be a host platform. But the question still remains. Yeah, I'm looking at this. And yeah, I think that would be a lot of hard questions to tabulate. and
I want to jump in. I totally agree. I think there's a lot of open-ended questions and it's actually surprising to me that we got this far down the road with a survey like this. Of that reason, I think we have to make them much easier to tabulate, multiple choice, yes, no, whatever, scale of 1 to 10. I mean, there are lots of ways you can structure a question so that it's easier to tabulate the results. But I also agree that using Engage Eugene, if we can do that, and I don't know, we certainly need your help, I suppose, or I don't know whose staff people are in charge of getting something up on there and how that works. But one question I have is, if we are presenting this, giving this presentation at neighborhood associations or wherever other community group type things, do you think, I mean, the one idea was that we would have, yes, we would have an automated and online way to answer, have people answer good questions. They could do it that way with the QR code, but we'd also have a paper copy available if people wanted to just do it at. Will people do that? I mean, do you think the people who attend your neighborhood meetings will they do anything, or will we just not hear from them?
Well, it's unlikely
Yeah, that's what I think.
that they'll do it in my personal experience. They're probably more likely to have a QR code, and even though there are accessibility issues, sometimes they're just. That's how it pans out.
If there was a QR code, you think they might do it just right then on their phone or something?
Well, they could get it,
They get
collect it, and then do it whenever they want.
Art.
So with Engage Eugene is just an online survey that sits there, and it could be the Sustainability Commission's survey.
I think that's what
So I think
happened.
you would hand out a sheet, we would have an ice sheet about the Sustainability Commission, a couple pictures and projects, and at the bottom in big print, to take the survey, go to Engage Eugene /sustainability/whatever. I mean, some
Right.
people will do it, but Maybe they won't, but at least that would be the way to do it. I don't think we want to collect handwritten things.
Yeah. Well, the QR, a lot of people are using QR codes, yeah, to get that, but yeah, that is, yeah. But I do, yeah, in my experience. Yeah, the handwritten surveys are not, and then who's gonna input those into the, like,
Whatever.
Yeah.
Database.
and also the
Imagine.
QR code could be,
Great.
if you present virtually. You could share a link to the survey, or you could share a QR code if someone's looking at a screen and they can literally read the QR code from a screen. So it's on a certain level, it's more accessible. It's more likely to be utilized.
Process
Well,
wise,
that also, Chris, another easy button, maybe what would be good is if we. Tape the presentation,
We talked, I think we talked about that in the.
yeah, made a then. Either we show up or we don't show up, to be there for the presentation. Well, because if you're there for, well, what I'm saying is that, how many of these meetings are we thinking about doing? How many of these presentations are we gonna be doing? And it's available if we're not individually available to go and give those. There's lots of, how many neighborhood groups are there?
So the neighborhood group could play it at their meeting
Right,
and then go to this and then.
I don't know, I think between all of us, we could.
No.
Yeah,
That's not the.
I'm willing
but
to
that
do
could
it.
happen.
That's what I've said, that I'm willing to be.
I think it would be beneficial to have a video for some uses and to have it online, but I think there's a lot to be gained
Well-
by an in-person presentation.
Process suggestion for next steps. I'm hearing from the room, and we can't vote on it. But I'm getting a sense of the room that open-ended written questionnaire is not making sense to anybody who's in the room right now. And the next step may be some folks who said we'd be on the committee, and I haven't been on the committee much because I had conflicts. Would meet with staff. We'd look at developing some questions that seem appropriate to be posted and engage Eugene. Does that seem like a next step that might be reasonable? Next step?
well, and I'm still gonna hammer this idea of creating a consistent one presentation that so we show up at these meetings maybe to answer questions, but that then we're giving the exact same thing to every neighborhood group without risking any political.
Yeah, I mean, that's.
Well, that's what
It's
they're
just-
doing.
The slide deck that's been developed is for that exact
Yeah.
purpose, is to have a script on the end of the slides.
Right.
Right.
But I think they don't have to meet with staff. They could get together and try to put together
Yeah.
8 multiple choice questions. And then.
And
come to
then
staff
coordinate
and-
with staff how to get them in the
As long as
engaged.
Ian commits to having a sustainability
I think
program.
one, if the
be willing
committee
to
is,
put that.
staff will have to be involved, because we'll have to have a public meeting over that, we'll have to do an announcement, recording all that, just to comply with the meetings on, for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's surveys out there that, these surveys kind of already exist. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel on writing a whole new survey. There's post-presentation feedback surveys, there's sustainability questionnaires where we can pull questions from, and that would save a lot of time.
That's why I suggested we
There you
want to
go.
meet with staff who have, those resources, more at hand than we do.
Or maybe staff could pass on some of those standard surveys to our committee, and then we could revisit it, because what I wasn't able to be part of this last month's work on this, which I wish I would have been, but I think it needs more time, I guess, and but this, I think we've definitely gotten some great feedback from the commission on this topic in this meeting, and then to give it another month to do a little more work, maybe in this new manner, knowing that we need to get more in a direction to of these easier to process questions on the back end, and then maybe borrowing from some pre-existing surveys would be a helpful jumping off place for us.
And then might be an advantage to starting small in scope, just having a couple very specific tailored questions and see how that goes.
And a short-lived 5 questions.
But I also think tracking back to what's the purpose of the survey is to gauge information on sustainability from the public or to gauge the benefit and effect of the actual presentation. Those are two completely different.
And that's, yeah, that still hasn't quite been narrowed
clear.
down.
And I think that's a committee question.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
I think we should talk about that at the committee. I think it wouldn't hurt to have one question that says, you know, was this presentation useful to you or on a.
Oh, yeah.
Right, one of those, what did you learn?
Scale of 1 to 10.
100%, yeah.
And then the rest of them are more content.
Yeah, no. Was it?
but like, could be like,
Are you
was the
still-
resource list that helpful, or were you aware of the resources on the resource list? And like, you could say, what sustainability things are you doing right now, and list some of the ones that were covered in the presentation or on the resource list, and have it be multiple choice. So it's not that we can't gather some of this information, it's like, what are we trying to gather information wise with this survey? That's the big question.
Right, if we could make motions, I'd be making a motion to refer to committee.
Yeah, I
I was
think
just going-
that's right. I think to sum up, I think we've agreed that we're gonna have the committee meet again to take this feedback and refine the survey questions. Gonna try and get some helpful drafts or some, you know, suggestions on questions from staff prior to that meeting and discuss that and bring it back.
I just have a logistical question for because number 7, that was my idea, would be just because it'd be great to get people's emails who are interested in being on this commission, because not so many people, so I don't know where that would go. Like, that, I guess it would just be a list that would be,
That's the one I would have to, if we're gonna use engage Eugene as a platform, I'd have to check on the ability of the city to collect that information.
right, that was like a logistical sort of technical
I don't have
question I
that
had
right.
about that, if we go that route.
Well, how about if you're interested in serving as a member, contact, blah, blah, blah.
It just, I suppose.
Well, and then I know, again, you know, this idea of the canned presentation. If not anything else, I really think that we should film it or put it in some kind of a form, because, you know, we're just thinking neighborhood groups, but you know, it could be a really valuable tool to the greater community. I'm like thinking we could give it to nursing homes, and maybe they could show it in schools, or, you know.
So it might be a both and. We
Yeah,
do it. committee by-
Churches, at Dennis's church programs, you know.
I definitely agree that it would be useful in a passive and active manner, like to have, it's more impactful to have a commissioner come and present it in person to some groups, but to have it in a passive form is also very helpful, and it broadens accessibility, which I think we should definitely do. It could sit on our page and then be used to, in the.
Show it at the Campbell's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Well, let's move on to,
I was wondering if this offers an opportunity to officially introduce Marion to the commission.
It was like, who are these two?
We'll probably transition straight into staff updates.
I think we've done step up. So this is seem like because it's related. I
Yeah.
think this is a good.
Yeah,
opportunity to
it's
officially
awesome.
introduce Marion.
So I am so pleased to announce Marion Barnes as our new Public Affairs Manager for Public Works. She started her career with the Statesman Journal, writing and editing, and moved into some web management. And then most recently, she's been, well, not most recently, she served for 6 years as the Director of Communications for Western Oregon University.
Yep.
So she was up there for a while, and then moved to Oregon Department of Education for the Early Learning Child Division. Thank
Early
you,
Learning
division.
soon to be
As-
Department of Early Learning and Care.
Yep, as Director of Communications. So she brings a lot of strategic communication, some marketing skills, outreach, engagement. So in her support of Public Works and the sustainability program, she would be able to consult with the Education Committee on a few of the questions that I've heard you guys wrestle with tonight.
Yeah.
I did work very closely with our research team at my most recent position, so I have a very good feel for survey best practices. I'm happy to advise if you desire.
Congratulations and welcome.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah, it was a good time to introduce her.
it was
Yeah.
perfect.
Thank you for
Sometimes
letting me
connect
introduce. Thank you.
Send us your email address. We'll be talking to you. soon.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's move on to updates from commissioners.
I'm willing to get an agenda just in terms of time now. You'd asked me before about it, do an update on the ETAC, the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee, in which I represent the commission. And so I'd rather share a little more information just on where we are on the agenda later. It's, the short version is it looks at land use issues and all the enhancements, et cetera, that can impact density. Other issues follows population trends, the kinds of questions you brought about, job development, et cetera. Part of it's meeting the legal requirement at the state level around justifying any adjustments in urban service boundaries. But there's a variety of data that I have found pretty intriguing, and I'd just like to enumerate a little bit for commissioners what that is. Sometimes it feels a little wonky, I got to admit, at those meetings. But, so that's a short version of it, but at a later meeting I could share it.
So what I'll do is we'll talk to Laura and Louisa about carving out maybe 10 minutes or something for you to present at the next meeting for this.
5 to 7
Yeah,
minutes.
so, okay. 5.5 minutes.
I will just say at one point right now that they're mostly appointed positions, and the only designated position is a member of the Planning Commission and a member of the Sustainability Commission is, designated slots on that advisory group. So most of the other folks are real estate folks and business folks who don't always look at the issues we think might be priorities of what they want to collect data about.
Yes.
Remember, I sent a letter to Laura and Louisa, so maybe something will come up at the next meeting. So I wanted to just indicate what that was. Several years ago, we made a recommendation to council about requiring all new homes to be EV ready, in a sense, which is really a 240-volt plug in your garage, and having that done at the time of construction of a home is cheaper, et cetera, like that. And that kind of ran into a roadblock because any change in building code would have to be approved at the state level. And so there's a state division of building codes, so that all cities don't have their own building codes and things like that. So it kind of sat there, and I called a couple of times. There has been some progress on multifamily, as we know, requiring some number of 40% of the slots or whatever, having that ability, but nothing around single family homes or duplexes or whatever. I had called up there a couple weeks ago. I said, well, is there any chance that something might be happening? And the building code people basically said, doesn't look like it, that's not going to be coming along. But he recommended, incentives or things like that. So I was thinking that we could write a letter to council or directly and suggest to them that they have a program incentivizing electric vehicles. They'll give you $500 to help you install the thing in an existing home. So I was thinking, why don't we ask them to extend that incentive program to new homes? They could give builders $200 incentive program to put and would be ready to plug in the garage of a new home. Didn't have to be $500 because it's cheaper to do it. I was the cost of materials at the time, probably less than $200 to take care of it. And given there's adequate power to the home, so there's kind of a thing to look at there. That would be.
I like it.
Yeah. So anyway, that would be the simplest thing to do. That it looks like something we could do to try to get more of those into new homes than are already there. So I was suggesting we don't need a new committee to do that. That this is kind of informally or an extension of that. And part of the materials for next meeting would be a rationale for that and the letter would be sent after the letter that we can send. The question is whether it goes to EWEB, can we advise EWEB or suggest something to EWEB directly, or do we have to suggest to the city council that they suggest to EWEB? So that's the only thing that maybe the end or somebody could check out about what would be possible if the commission would like to do something.
Yeah, if nothing else, we're going to have a very comprehensive work plan of possibilities of topics, everything we think we might want to talk about. We need to be on the work. Anyway, no, I like it. I wish I'd gotten those incentives when I built 3 years of city.
So this is more, it's kind of like a question hoping for an update that we can maybe discuss offline, but I'm curious where we're at with the leaf blower committee. And what.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been
Process.
voted on, but the
Yes.
process is
Yes.
confusing.
And the process is a little confusing to staff as well. I think a little bit of history, and I'll be quick because I know we're at
Yeah,
time. So this arose last fall when we went to the council for the work session to have the work plan approved. And it was identified to me that there was disagreement between the ordinance that established the commission and some of the bylaws in the working agreement that are there. And that there's a condition within the ordinance that basically says any committee needs to be approved by council at the time that the work plan is approved. That's not the exact language. That's basically the gist of that. And so there wasn't a process to stand up a committee off cycle. And so we're still continuing to work on what that process is.
Totally, and I mean, I appreciate that, but there's also a line, and I think Jan reiterated my thoughts on that, that says, and anything sort of that comes up relating to, you know, in the work plan.
Yeah, we called it
Right,
emerging topic.
emerging topics, emerging issues.
But the actual approval of the committee itself is something that, so the education committee that has been working was actually approved by council back last fall.
Sure, and that's fine. It just seemed like there was some other things in there that I wasn't really sure how.
In terms of how to actually line up this
Yeah,
issue.
exactly.
That's not the issue. It's actually getting through the process of how this is put on council's consent agenda to actually approve is the process we're working on internally right now.
Okay, good, because when the last email I had about it seemed a little bit more like it had to do with not asking for staff hours or like
No,
these
that-
sort of very, very
that- Sorry, I
specific.
thought I responded to that, and said that had been sorted in terms of understanding that. I'm pretty sure I responded to that. I may not have, but I thought I
I
had.
don't feel like I saw it. And I apologize
So-
profusely if I missed it.
Is that, I think that was an issue of trying to clarify that it wasn't done because Danielle or I would have to help set up Zooms and be part of those meetings, et cetera. And once that was clarified, that was taken off the table. That wasn't an issue.
Okay,
The idea that this is something that would fall under the other emerging issues also wasn't. It's literally the process of how this is gone through the process of being approved within the city and a decision made to whether or not to put it on the consent agenda to put it in front of council. That's what we're working through right now.
and yeah, I apologize. I did not see that email.
Okay.
So we've been operating in some sense illegally for about the last 5 years, probably.
I've been told 10, but I've been told 10.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's, and that was raised as well as part of this conversation that, you know, the precedent, how this is unfolded historically has been the following, and I was told that that doesn't necessarily matter, that precedent, you know, the ordinance says the following, and if the bylaws are in conflict with the ordinance is what takes precedence over that. And so it's an attempt to just come up with a more defined, consistent process for how this is done. And I think it changes my thinking because this wasn't something that necessarily came up when we were having a retreat. And it's something now I think would change the thinking in terms of the planning that goes into that as well. But I think having a process in place so that when new issues do emerge, it's not just an ad hoc linearly process, that there is something defined that we've been agreed to and that we've, you know, we're checking all the, checking all the boxes that need to be checked. And that's just taking time to work through the different pieces of the government that I'm trying to get that work through.
No, that's great. I mean, that's what I was looking for.
Okay.
Yeah,
My line of
Let's just
questioning.
have you be the last two comments, just because we're pretty much at time and I want to respect.
So the sense I'm getting at this point is it's just that it looks like we need to have a very comprehensive list of possibilities on a work plan if emerging issues is not a viable option. We got to list everything we think might emerge. And then we have pre-approved authority to explore this list of possibilities.
Yeah, I think the discussion, and it's unfortunate that Laura and Louise are not here today, but there was a meeting that the leadership had with Mayor, City Manager, Councilor Semple last fall. And I think the goal is to try and figure out how this aligns with council's priorities and what staff are working on. And so it's not necessarily, here's an issue that's of interest, but how does this align with cap implementation? How does this align with council's priorities? How does this align with where the city is focusing on right now? And how this supplements that work through the commission's input and advice.
Right, well, we know from a council member who's a member of this commission, the issue that committee was gonna raise was an issue that she was glad we were gonna discuss.
but she's used to the road committee.
So an overall thought about the work plan, council wants to be able to approve your work plan to hopefully help make sure that your work is aligned with their work, right? That makes it effective for both sides. So your committees either need to be approved in the beginning or as you go and as you think of them. The idea of creating a smorgasbord of everything in the beginning, it's still gonna have to be approved by council. And they're still gonna ask you to narrow it down to be effective for them. So the idea of just creating anything, I don't
No,
think it's what
okay.
their intent is.
Yeah, that was an element of sarcasm.
Okay,
but-
okay. I just want to help, I just want to help the group stay effective with council. Otherwise, you're gonna move back to the frustrating point of you're working on something and they're not gonna have the time to pick it up.
Right, and we send it to council and we never hear it.
Yeah.
So that is the trade-off. I mean, it's we only are doing what they want. I'm sorry, Jim. I know you were there.
So I think that that's right. So it would be helpful for us to know, at least by our retreat, if we do decide we want to establish a new committee in the middle of the year, if something comes up, how long is that likely to take to try to get something to council, and how is that gonna work? But my original question really was, is this the same process for all the boards and commissions?
I mean, I think they're trying to, the city manager's office is trying to come up with a consistent way in which, but I think this commission works a little bit differently than other commissions in terms of what their focus is and what the charge is as is in the code. So each one has a little bit of adjustments that's based on kind of what their focus is on and what kind of their charges and how they're supporting council or the type of work that they're focused on. And so each one is adjusted a little bit, but yes, there's a decision to try and, so the Human Rights Commission, for example, has a set of rules in terms of how they interact with the media, and they have a bunch of procedures and guidelines for how they do that and how decisions gets made under that framework. So each one, based on what their mission is, does have a set of guidelines that they're operating under for those things.
Thing that I hear you're saying, we could propose a committee in the middle of the year, but we haven't done the research. The whole point is that we have a committee and then we really look into it and we see what's feasible, what could we recommend, what is the background data, what have other places done. Then they might even like to see it. But if we just say leaf blowers, well, forget that. But if we show all the arguments and the research and the background and what you could do and what the price of electric leaf blowers and how many communities have done that, they might actually take up the issue. So that's the only problem with that approach, I think. And you're right, we then maybe only hit on 1 out of 4 things that we send up, but we hit on fossil fuel. There's been a variety of things over time that we've hit on. I mean, it is a matter of whether the commission was willing to work on things that we thought was very important, and maybe council will address them. But I understand the law is telling us that's not what we can do, but I hope that for the activity level and the excitement of being on the commission, that there can be found a way so that we can really make them change in the city that they didn't even think they wanted to do, but well.
Absolutely. May I add a comment? Right now, you're dealing with the growing pains of all of us figuring out how to get consistent with managing the commissions and the rules and what the attorney's office is asking us to do to make sure that we're in line with regulations. So once we get the process figured out, in the future, it will be much more clear. We're hoping it's as simple as a commission has asked for a committee to be opened so that we can explore something. It gets put on the consent agenda. The consent agenda with city council isn't a discussion item, right? They've read it before, they approve it in the minutes, it just moves right along. It's not a 45-minute work session where a lot of effort has to be put into it. So we're hoping that idea is acceptable with the attorney's office and with city council, but we're all adjusting to figuring out the growing pains of getting much more consistent and hopefully helpful with what the city manager's office and city council need us to be able to do to be effective for them.
So process of getting on that agenda that we're working through right now, like who's looking, who weighs in, kind of what that decision point is, what the frequency of that is. And that's the process that's just, we're working through it. And that's just taking the time it's taking.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of the meeting. So.
We never officially convened. It was a long and convenient.
It's all your fault. It's all your fault.